Let's get started on Chapter 1, Overview and Installation. In this section, we will discuss the purpose of Windows Server, the additions of Windows Server, installation, initial configuration, navigation, installation methods, and server core. Let's start out with the purpose of Windows Server. Windows Server is a network operating system. And the purpose of a network operating system is to control and coordinate the hardware, software, and data components of a server. Windows Server can function as a file server, or a domain controller, or as a DHCP server. It can perform any of these roles. And this introduces the term server role. When we say server role, we are referring to the function that the server performs. The server can perform the file server role, or the domain controller role, or the DHCP server role. There are three main categories of server roles: directory services, infrastructure service, and applications. An example of a directory services role would be the domain controller, the login server. Infrastructure service roles include DHCP server, DNS server, Windows deployment server, Windows update server, or remote access server. And application roles include web server, print server, file server, and remote desktop server. Windows Server can perform any of these roles. So Windows Server is a network operating system. It is a platform onto which you can install whichever roles you need, either just one of them or all of them. Let's now look at the additions of Windows Server, and we will see there are four additions: Data Center, Standard, Essentials, and Foundation. And Essentials and Foundation are only for small business. They only support 15 to 25 users. Most of us are going to be working with the Standard or the Data Center editions. The Data Standard and the Data Center editions are very similar. The Standard edition would be used on a standard corporate server, and that server might function as a domain controller, or a DHCP server, or a database server, or a file server. The Data Center edition is what you would install on a big old data center server that had a large number of CPUs and a large amount of RAM, and which ran a large number of virtual machines. And that's the big difference between the two. Standard edition is not designed to support a large number of virtual machines, but Data Center is designed to support a large number of virtual machines, and we will discuss virtualization in Chapter 7. Let's look at some of the prices. Standard edition, $600. But if you look at Data Center edition, $10,000, and that's for the software alone. And then, of course, a CAL, a client access license, is required for each user who logs in, and that could be $39. To download a free copy of Windows Server, you go to www.microsoft.com and select Try, and select Download the Evaluation Windows Server 2012 Release 2. And notice step number 2 says Register, and that means you have to create a username and password on Microsoft's web server. And then you download install the full-featured install. This is not a student edition. This is a full-featured copy of Windows Server for a 180-day trial. And then after 180 days, theoretically, you like it and you buy it for only $10,000. Or you do what students do, you just reinstall it after 180 days. So you download the ISO image, you burn it to a DVD, and now you have a DVD which you can use to install Windows Server. Installation, system requirements, and installation procedures. If we look at the system requirements, we can see that Windows Server requires a minimum of a 1.4 gigahertz 64-bit CPU, 512 megabytes of RAM, and 32 gig of disk space. And you might say, my laptop has more processing power than that. This is no processing power at all. Well, that's just the bare minimum required to get Windows Server up and running. You wouldn't really install Windows Server on a computer which had so little processing power. Even on a small server, you would want to have a dual core 2 gigahertz processor and 4 gig of RAM and a 500 gig hard disk. And on a large server, you might have 64 quad core CPUs, 4 terabytes of RAM, and multiple 2 terabyte hard disks. But the bare minimum requirement is 1.4 gigahertz, 64 CPU, 512 meg of RAM, and 32 gig of disk space. To perform a clean installation, you have two main parts. The first part is you boot from the DVD and you copy the files from the DVD to the server hard disk, and then you perform the initial configuration tasks, which include assigning a computer name, assigning an IP address, and setting a time zone. So to perform the clean installation, you take the DVD, you put it in the server, you turn on the server, and you boot to the DVD. You turn the computer on, and it boots, and we see press any key to boot from the DVD. So at this point, press any key, and that way it'll boot from the Windows DVD, and now we can see setup is starting, and now we see Windows setup screen. We select the language to install, English, then we click on next. Then we select install now. We could select the standard edition with server core only, but we are going to select data center edition with graphical user interface. We click on next and we accept the licensing agreement followed by next. Then we do not select upgrade because we're not doing an upgrade, we're doing a first time clean install. To do a first time clean install, you select custom. To do a first time clean install, you select custom, install Windows only. So we click on custom install, and then we specify the disk that we want to install Windows Server on, typically the first hard disk, followed by next. And then the files are copied from the DVD to the hard disk of our server, and this can take a little bit of time. And if I speed up the screen, then the system reboots, and it reboots, and at this time do not press any key to boot from the DVD. And then it wants us to specify a password for the administrator. So we type in the password for the administrator, and we retype the password, and we click on next. It finalizes our settings, and now it says to log into Windows Server, we press Control-Alt-Delete. I press Control-Alt-Delete. I type in the administrator's password. It welcomes me, and now I am logged on to Windows Server. Now, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you will see there is an icon for Server Manager. If I click on that icon, it brings up Server Manager. And if I click on Local Server, I can see that the computer name is a randomly generated name. So what I need to do is to assign a computer name. So after copying all the files from the DVD to the hard disk and then rebooting, then I run initial configuration tasks, and this is also known as post-installation tasks, where I assign a computer name, I assign an IP address, and I set the time zone. So, to perform the initial configuration tasks, and this is also mentioned in Chapter 2, I go into Server Manager. I go to the Task Manager on the bottom left of the taskbar, and I select Server Manager. Under Server Manager, I select Local Server, and here is the randomly generated computer name. To change that, I click on the computer name, I click on Change. I then delete the randomly generated computer name, and I type in a computer name, and they also call this the host name. I click on More, and I specify the primary DNS suffix, which in this case will be ccbcmd.edu. Then I press OK and OK, and then it tells me for these changes to apply, I have to restart the computer. And I will restart the computer, but not just yet, because I need to assign an IP address. So to assign an IP address, I select Ethernet followed by IPv4. I right-click on the Ethernet adapter, select Properties. I select IP version 4 followed by Properties. Then I select the radio button that says Use the following IP address. Then I assign an IP address. I assign a subnet mask. I assign a default gateway, and I specify the IP address of the DNS server. And if you're doing this on a home network, most likely default gateway and DNS server are going to be the same. I click on OK and close, and I close network connections, but before rebooting, I need to go over to time zone, and I change the time zone. I select the drop down, and we select -5 hours Greenwich Mean Time. So now I have set the time zone and the computer name, but notice the computer name does not change until I reboot the computer. Two ways to reboot the computer: graphical user interface, command line interface. To reboot from the graphical user interface, as you know from Windows 7 or Windows 10, if I press Control-Alt-Delete, on the bottom right-hand corner, I have an icon that allows me to shut down or restart, and that's one way to go. Or another way is to restart from the command line. To get to the command line, I first go to the Metro interface, then I type CMD. To get to the Metro interface, you can either click on the Windows Start button on the bottom left-hand corner, or just press the Windows key, which is on the keyboard. So I press the Windows key, which is on the keyboard, and this takes me to what they call the Metro or tile interface. To get to the command prompt, I simply type CMD, and it brings up the command prompt, and I click on that. Then to restart the computer, I type restart /R, and the R will reboot the computer. So I press the enter key, and it then shuts down, and it shuts down, and it reboots the server. And at this time, I do not press any key to boot from the DVD. And then I type in the administrator password. And then if I go to the icon for Server Manager, and I select Local Server, I can see, yes, I have successfully installed Windows Server, and there is the computer name, and there is the static IP address. So installation has two main parts. First, you just boot from the DVD, and that copies all the files from the DVD to the hard disk. Then you reboot, and you go to initial configuration tasks. And initial configuration tasks is where you specify computer name, IP address, and time zone. And this concludes our section on overview and installation.